They arrived in a silence that felt heavier than the heat. Thin lines of men funneling through wire and wood, boots scuffing dust that clung to their uniforms like a second skin. Some carried the hard glaze of recent battle in their eyes, others the muted stare of those who had marched too far for too long. No one spoke if they could help it. Orders barked in a language most did not understand. Echoing around the camp made them move in fits and pauses, like a herd circling a place it did not trust. A clipboard passed from hand to hand. Names were recorded, numbers assigned. Medical staff peered into ears and mouths, raised brows at infected cuts, prodded ribs that jutted too sharply beneath sweat-darkened fabric. The smell of iodine and paper and ration tins hung in the air. A sergeant in green gloves asked questions with gestures. A soldier in a white armband used a pencil like a conductor's baton to direct them forward. After registration and the issuing of basic kits, metal cups, a thin towel, a rough bar of soap sealed in waxy paper, they were brought to a long wooden building with pipes snaking overhead and steam floating lazily from vents along the roof. For a moment the line hesitated, the bodies at the front slowing to a stop, not from defiance, but from a kind of collective confusion. The building was unlike anything they had seen on the islands. Taller than a barracks, with a high-ribbed ceiling and rows of valves fastened to metal. The scent was peculiar, sharp, clean, medicinal, almost sweet, in a foreign way. Inside, the first thing they noticed were the nozzles. A forest of them, protruding from pipes in straight rows like metal flowers ready to open. There were drains underfoot, slatted benches along the wall, hooks hammered into planks. A medic pointed at boots, then at the concrete floor. He said something. Many of the prisoners, not following the words, looked at his hands, which made a stripping motion, then at the benches, then at the hooks. Some of the men froze where they stood. They had been herded, inspected, prodded. They had been marched and counted and pushed. This room of pipes and drains, asked them for something different. It asked them to surrender the thin barrier of cloth still separating them from the eyes of their captors. For a few breaths, no one moved. Then the sound of running water hissed from one of the lines as a guard, impatient, turned a valve just enough to send a demonstration stream cascading to the floor. He opened his palms and nodded insistently. The meaning was plain. Clothes fell away in careful layers, each man folding his fatigue shirt, placing his belt upon it, setting boots side by side as they would back home, where order brought a sense of dignity. Some clutched their towels to their waists, uncertain and shy. The embarrassment ran deeper than modesty. The human body, scarred, sunburned, bitten by insects, spotted with sores, told too many stories at once. They did not want to be read like that. A young American with a red cross on his armband moved down the line, speaking in slow English, pointing from towel to water to soap. He handed one man a small canvas bag and mimed scrubbing his armpit, his hair, his feet. Another soldier held up a tin shaker and puffed an invisible cloud into his palm before tapping it over a sleeve. A few of the men flinched at the sight of the powder. Fear traveled quickly as a whisper. "What is that? What will they spray?" The answer came in motions and in the careful faces of the medics. The powder was a delousing agent. The shower was water. The soap, though foreign and strongly scented, was soap. And yet suspicion held, for suspicion had kept many of them alive. The water began to run in earnest. Not a trickle from a dented canteen or a careful pour from a captured drum, but an endless, robust flood pouring in bright, clear arcs from each head. It rattled against the concrete, pooled around the drains, sent up a mist that smelled like tin and a public bathhouse and rain on hot stone. A man stepped beneath it and gasped, not in alarm, but in surprise. It was warm. Another soldier, hesitant, held out his hand and recoiled at the unfamiliar luxury, then edged in and tilted his head back, eyes closed. mouth open as if tasting something remembered and forgotten all at once. For months, many of them had known water mostly as a ration measured in mouthfuls, as a weight carried up ridges, as a taste tainted by rusted barrels and jungle leaves. They had washed in streams when they could, and in puddles when they could not, scrubbing at sweat with damp cloth, dabbing at salt-crusted skin. Back home, in villages and cities, there had been hot baths and clouds rising from wooden tubs, the comfort of immersion at day's end. That memory had existed like something seen in a dream, both precise and unreal. Now it returned with force, summoned not by a tub, but by this many-headed storm inside a wooden building thousands of miles from any home. Silence changed shape. It became an attentive hush, broken by small sounds, a groan of relief from someone whose back had ached for weeks, the stifled laugh of a young man who had not meant to laugh, but couldn't help it, as the water found the tender hollow behind his ear, the squeak of wet feet shifting for a better spray, the tick of rings, dog tags, tapping against collarbones. A medic moved amongst them with the tin shaker, dusting powder along the seams of discarded trousers, down the backs of shirts, across the crowns of heads. The powder clung like snow. Someone sneezed and shook his hair, a boyish gesture that for 1 second rewound time. Lice and fleas had made nights a waking misery. The scratch-itch-scratch rhythm had been a constant under the louder drum of artillery and hunger. To feel that dance end, even for a while, was the kind of mercy that reorients a man inside his own skin. Soap foamed in unfamiliar abundance. It was not the brown, utilitarian bar some remembered from childhood, nor the handmade soap from a rural kitchen. This soap had a factory smell, perfumed, persistent, American. In some hands it turned quickly to suds, sliding away from the body and down the drain. So much water meeting, so much lather that a few prisoners laughed again, embarrassed at the wastefulness of it all even as they surrendered to it. They learned its weight and drag, how much to rub, where to hold it high to keep it from slipping. Voices in English threaded through the steam. An interpreter, a young man with Japanese features and an American uniform, moved between clusters of prisoners, offering words that turned the gestured commands into sentences. Rinse thoroughly. Use the soap under your arms and between your toes. Wash your hair. If you have sores, show the medic. The instructions landed without insult, the voice a bridge that felt improbably solid. Then there were razors, lined up on a table next to brushes and real mirrors that reflected faces some men barely recognized. The razors came with a demonstration. Foam in the palm, bristles lifted, blade angle shallow, slow strokes downward. Rinse. Repeat. For men who'd been hacking at stubble with pocket knives or letting beards grow wild, the ritual was both humiliating and exquisite. Few things strip a man to basics like shaving under supervision. Few things restore a sense of self like seeing your face, new again, beneath the beard's shadow. One soldier, his cheek nicked, dabbed at a dot of blood and smiled at nothing in particular as if to say, "There you are." Clean towels were passed along the line. They were thin, rough, and they were plenty. The towel against clean skin, even a scratchy one, felt like an embrace. Bodies dried. Small private shivers moved through the room as the warmth evaporated. The air continued to smell of soap and powder, and a ghostly citrus from some cleanser used to scour the floors. The clothing that followed, fresh undershirts, trousers without sweat-salted stiffening, socks with intact heels, settled over new skin like armor fitted for comfort rather than battle. Boots cleaned with brush and rag squeaked faintly on the damp floor. The men stood a little taller, not because anyone ordered it, but because it is easier to carry yourself when you are not carrying dirt. Later, as they were led out past the door, something happened that none of them would have predicted just an hour before. Unprompted, A few turned their heads and looked back at the pipes and nozzles, at the room that had first seemed suspicious, and then had delivered a sensation so ordinary at home and so miraculous here. It was a room built not to hurt or to interrogate, but to cleanse. The realization lodged in the chest like a small, persistent warmth. In the camp's days that followed, hygiene was not a single event, but a rhythm. Schedules were posted and enforced. Wake up! Wash faces at the long sinks, the mirrors fogging quickly as lines formed. This time with less reluctance. Soap had to last. Toothbrushes, when distributed, drew a quiet stir. Brushing was familiar to some and new to others. A medic showed a group how to angle the bristles at the gum line, how long to keep going, how not to swallow the sharp mint foam. The toothpaste's taste startled them. It was sweet, then bitter, then oddly cooling. Some gagged and then laughed, wiping chins on their sleeves. Latrines were built with care and oversight. Boards were scrubbed daily. Barrels of disinfectant standing by with ladles. Signage posted with rules explained through interpreters. In the tropics, disease could undo a unit faster than bullets. Here, the unbending American insistence on cleanliness, formality in soap and brush and order, was both practical and a kind of code. The message, whether intended or not, was simple. You are under our control, and under our control you will be kept clean, and in keeping you clean, we will keep ourselves secure. The arrangement was transactional, but it carried, in its daily trivia, the beginnings of something more like mutual recognition. Laundry day became a ceremony of sorts. Some prisoners found the wash-house machines mesmerizing. Big-bellied metal drums with portholes and knobs, belts turning with a steady whine. Clothes went in dirty, disappeared under soapy agitation, emerged lighter in color, wrung nearly dry. In places where machines were absent, barrels and basins did the same work under human power. Shirts beaten against boards, soap rubbed into collars, rinse water poured and carried and poured again. Lines of clean clothes fluttered like flags of a nation that no one would claim but everyone needed. In the afternoon, men walked past lines to find their shirt by the patched hole at the seam or the particular fray at the cuff. Each piece a small shard of identity reclaimed from the pile. The camp barbers set up under a canopy. Hair fell in soft drifts around ankles, revealing scalps that had not seen the sun in months. For the first few days, heads were clipped close not only as a matter of preference, but as policy. Short hair was easier to keep clean, harder for lice to hide in. The buzzing clippers sang like cicadas. For some, the loss of hair was a reminder of loss in general, another surrender. For others, it was relief, a coolness across the skull that made the world feel a breath nearer. There were foot inspections that everyone dreaded, and many secretly appreciated. Medics crouched with flashlights, checked between toes, pressed thumbs into arches to test for swelling. The language barrier was thin here. Pain speaks clearly no matter the tongue. Powder was shaken into boots. Ointments were dabbed onto cracked heels. The first time someone received a new pair of socks without holes, he grinned as if handed a family heirloom. Bathing days rotated through the company blocks. The shower building, once a place of tension, became a hub. Stories began there. Whispered jokes, memories swapped in low voices, fragments of home pieced together and held up like shards of colored glass. Men leaned against the walls and admitted to each other, not without embarrassment, that the first shower had made them dizzy with feeling. They didn't have the words to explain to their captors, and perhaps they didn't need to. Among themselves, they built a vocabulary of nods and gestures to speak of it. There were still hard edges to camp life. Inspections were strict. A basin left dirty earned a punishment detail. Towels had to be returned, counted, folded the way a particular corporal preferred. Soap couldn't be hoarded, at least not officially. Men inventoried their allotment like treasurers counting coins, slicing bars with knives to stretch them, trading a pinch of tobacco for an extra sliver. The ingenuity of scarcity did not disappear merely because the showers ran hot. It adapted. Not all surprises were pleasant. For some, the first crash of modern plumbing, the clank and whoosh as pressure shifted in the pipes, was a startle that sent them back to the caves and ravines from which they'd been driven. A man would duck involuntarily, heart slamming, eyes searching for cover. The body did not stop being cautious just because the water smelled of flowers instead of fear. And there were men with wounds that water could not soothe, aches anchored deep in bone, a heaviness in the chest that settled even on bright days. Clean skin did not erase grief. It did, however, give grief a surface through which to breathe. In quieter hours, thoughts drifted to home baths that had been both ritual and refuge. The Japanese bath, with its emphasis on washing first and soaking after, on shared heat and separate cleanliness, had taught many of these men that bathing was not only about removing dirt, it was about resetting the hour, letting the day's weight drop into steaming water. The camp showers were different. They were functional, fast, aligned with efficiency. You stepped in, scrubbed, stepped out. Yet beneath that was a common truth. Whether sitting neck-deep in a cedar tub or standing under a shower head beneath steel pipes, the human need was the same. To be made new, even briefly. To feel, with each rivulet cutting a line through grime, that the world might still contain gentleness. The American staff, for their part, witnessed something they had not expected. They had braced for hostility, and sometimes they got it. They had braced for cunning, and often they got that too. What surprised them were the expressions that settled on faces in the minutes after a shower. The softening that comes when a man is warm and clean. The way posture loosens without losing dignity. It was difficult, after seeing that, to think only in terms of enemy and threat. In the steam, men looked like sons and brothers. One morning, a medic named Evans, Freckles, a cowlick that refused discipline, found himself offering a bar of soap to an older prisoner whose hands trembled. The man took the soap carefully, as if it might break, then held it against his nose for a moment, eyes closing. He said something in Japanese that Evans did not understand. The interpreter was down the line, busy. Evans did the only thing he could think to do. He nodded, as if he had indeed understood, and pointed to the shower head, then to his own heart. The older man grinned. He stepped into the water like a pilgrim stepping into a shrine. By the second week, routines had become landmarks in a landscape otherwise unsettled. A chart pinned near the showers recorded which blocks had which hours. Arrows marked directions of flow. Some men arrived early, hovering nearby like birds near a feeder, impatient and embarrassed by their impatience. Others were always last, lingering in the privacy of hesitation. The water did not rush them. It simply ran, as it always had, commanded by a turn of the hand. In the mess hall, new practices mirrored those in the wash house. Hands were to be washed before meals, a rule enforced by a corporal who stood by the door like a gatekeeper, pointing to the bucket and the bar each time someone tried to slip past. The soap near the mess line was not perfumed. It smelled plain and harsh, a promise that germ and grease would not make it to the tray. After eating, trays were scraped clean, bins rinsed. The system reduced flies and sickness. It also established a cadence. Move, wash, eat, wash again. That restored to time a texture absent on the battlefield, where hours bled into each other and the day was measured in shell bursts and orders shouted over the wind. Sometimes, after lights out, a man would lie awake and smell the faint residue of soap on his own skin, buried beneath the ever-present odors of canvas and dust and bodies. He would remember the feel of his mother's hands scrubbing the back of his neck with a washcloth until he had cried out, and she had laughed, a laugh that had annoyed him then and seemed now like gold. Or he would think of a public bathhouse in the city, his father talking politics with neighbors while steam fogged mirrors, and the water slapped against the sides of the tubs. The memory did not make him more a prisoner or less a soldier. It made him, for a few heartbeats, a person in a life that was bigger than the war. Sickness moved in and out of the blocks like weather. When malaria hit, when dysentery made men fold into themselves, when fevers set cheeks aflame, the routines of hygiene became both shield and solace. The infirmary smelled strongly of disinfectant and boiled bandages. Sheets were clean, changed, and changed again. Waste was managed with a precision that felt like care. For the men who tended to their enemies, cleanliness was not sentiment, it was survival. For the men who received that attention, it was proof that the world had not narrowed completely to cruelty. Once, during a lull in the constant demands of the camp day, two prisoners argued, quietly but fiercely, about what the showers meant. One said they were a trick of the mind, a sop thrown to keep them docile. The other said it did not matter why the water ran, only that it did, and that he felt different when he stepped out, as if some part of him that had shrunk had begun, timidly, to expand. They did not resolve the argument. Later, they stood in line together, bodies angled toward the door where the familiar humidity spilled out. Small rituals blossomed around the act. A man would always wash his left ear first, because his daughter had once reached up and tugged at it, giggling. Another always rubbed the bar of soap across the heart of his palm twice before he began, as if waking it. Someone else, who had lost a friend in a place where there was no water at all, stood under the spray for exactly a count of 50 each time, eyes closed, lips moving. He did not name the number's significance to anyone. The cultural lines that had felt so thick grew thinner in practice. For all their differences, both captor and captive understood the stubborn dignity that cleanliness affords. An American corporal smoothed his combed hair each morning in a mirror tacked to a post, his ritual no less serious than the prisoner's careful folding of a shirt. A Japanese sergeant, older, with a face like carved wood, took to instructing the younger men in how to care for the body with what few tools were provided. He made a lesson of nail trimming, of scraping dirt from beneath with the edge of a matchbook, of drying thoroughly between toes to prevent rot. The American medics noticed and let him do it. Practical alliances grew in the spaces where shared interests stacked neatly. Fewer infections, fewer medical emergencies, fewer incidents. There were moments when humor slipped in sideways and stayed. A man stepped out of the shower, forgot the towel was not around his waist but draped over his shoulder, and reached for it too late, slipping and catching himself on a friend's arm. They howled with laughter, the kind that leaves you bent and breathless. A guard at the door tried to glare and failed, the corner of his mouth betraying him. For a brief burst of time, the room belonged to no one and everyone, a bubble of neutrality in a hostile world. Even as the novelty faded, the memory of that first day did not. It remained bright at the edges, a story told quietly, the details almost ritualistic in their repetition. The shock of warmth, the sting of soap in eyes that made men blink furiously, the powdered dust like snow, the mirrors and the faces inside them that looked both familiar and strange, the towel, the clean socks, the feeling of being contained again within skin that was theirs. Elsewhere in the camp, men wrote letters. Sometimes they did not know what to say. Accounts of battle were edited by censors and emotions, impossible to untangle on paper, kept their secrets. But it was easy to write about water. They described the showers in lines that almost turned into poetry. Water falling like rain on a summer road, the sound of it hitting the concrete like applause, the way steam curled upward and made a halo of everything. They asked their wives to write back about home, about whether the old bathhouse still smelled of cedar, about whether their children played in the tub until their fingers wrinkled. In the exchange of these mundane details, The world grew manageable again. Time did what time does. Men were moved in and out of the camp. Seasons buckled and stretched. The shower house remained. For new arrivals, it was a shock. For those who had been there, it became a point around which to orient yourselves. I will get through the work detail, and then the shower. I will endure the medic's questions, and then the shower. I will hold my tongue, swallow my anger, bend my back to the task. And at day's end, I will stand under that insistent rain and let it insist on something other than war. No one would say that modern hygiene saved them. It did not resolve the questions that haunted nights or soften the iron of captivity. It did not turn enemies into friends, not wholesale, but it threaded through each day a strand of normalcy strong enough to hold weight. To wash after weeks without washing is to discover that the surface of the body is a map of all it has survived. Each scar, each abrasion tells its own small story. Each swirl of soap sketches a counter-narrative, one in which the body is not just a battlefield, but a home. When the war ended for them, through transfer, through exchange, through time, the men who had learned the camp's rituals would carry away more than the memory of barbed wire and shouted orders. Some would remember that simple building with its pipes and drains and the endless, generous rush of water. They would remember, perhaps most keenly, the way their own hands had felt against their own skin the first time they were truly clean again. Not as soldiers, not as captives, but as men. In telling the story later, in words or in silence, a few would offer a small confession that surprised even them. That on the day they first lined up and stepped inside, they were more frightened than any rifle had made them. Not because they expected pain, though fear had trained them to expect it, but because they did not know whether they would recognize themselves once the dirt was gone. It turned out they did. They recognized themselves and each other, and once recognized, it became a little harder to forget, even in the darkest hours. The shower's sound, the constant falling of water in patient sheets, became, in memory, a kind of music. In that music, men found an odd companionship with those who had built the building and kept it running. Somewhere a man in an unfamiliar uniform had turned a wrench against a bolt, had tightened a gasket, had tested a valve. Somewhere a line item in a ledger had listed soap and powder and towels next to ammunition and fuel. The bureaucratic mingled with the intimate, the practical with the profound. That was the truth of it. Years after, one of them would stand in his own home again. The walls of his bathroom close and familiar, the mirror's frame scratched by so many mornings. He would turn the tap. Water would rush and steam, just as it had halfway around the world. He would step into it and close his eyes, and, for a few seconds, the years would fold on themselves like a map closing. He would see the long wooden building, the pipes overhead, the men moving quietly, and then not so quietly as laughter bubbled up. He would smell the soap, feel the rough towel on his shoulders. He might smile. He might say nothing to anyone. He might let the shower run an extra minute, not because he had been deprived, but because he understood in his bones that in the gentle insistence of water falling, there is a promise that, even after the worst we do to one another, we can make a small, daily choice toward mercy. So it began in a place of suspicion and in the uncomfortable theater of exposure. It became routine, and then something like sanctuary. In that transformation lies a lesson that does not require speeches. You can hear it as plainly as water hitting concrete. That cleanliness is not only a matter of soap and temperature, but of recognizing the humanity in bodies.